So again, I want to welcome everybody here this afternoon for this year's George F. Kennan Forum on Does Peace Pay? I wanted to say a little bit a word about why we decided to pick this topic. It's the last 10, 12 years in the U.S. have, I think, fundamentally changed our collective relationship with peace. So whether it was the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, large-scale international terrorism coming to our shores, global economic recession, what it means in this world to have stability, to have violence, to have war, security, economics, justice, have all melded together in some ways into this idea of peace, maybe in a way that hasn't happened since the mid to late 60s. So we thought it was appropriate to have a public discussion about what does the word peace mean? What does that concept mean to us? Both not just conceptually, but practically, what does it mean to us? So that's why we have our panel here, and I'll introduce them in a minute. I'm Robert Sigliano. I'm the director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, which is part of the Center for International Education at UWM. And one of the main activities of the center is an annual academic conference, and this year the academic conference is also, not coincidentally, on peace. So we have a distinguished group of scholars from around the country to spend a couple days together to really dive deeply into these various dimensions of peace. That conference is happening starting 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, going through Friday afternoon at the Hefter Center on the UWM campus. I also wanted to highlight some other things that are happening that really help to expand this idea of peace and its implications. The Institute is starting a summer program, summer leadership program for high school students called Global Action Through Engagement, the pilot of which will be happening this summer. We also have an International Focus YouTube channel. International Focus is our weekly television show that's on Milwaukee Public Television. We're also developing a global educators network for K-12, post-secondary and community educators to come together around global events here in Milwaukee. I also want to say congratulations to the group at UWM that has been putting together a new master's in sustainable peace building. Professor Tim Ellinger, who's going to be the faculty director of the program, is sitting here. So if you want to apply, I know you're several years off from a master's program, but still not too early to think about it. See Tim. But it's been a really innovative transdisciplinary degree that brings together lots of departments and schools at UWM, all focusing on this theme of sustainability and peace building. So it's been a very active couple years at UWM around this issue of peace and what it means. I want to thank our co-sponsors and media partners, again, the Center for International Education at UWM, our media partners, Wisconsin Public Radio. And there is a note, you may have seen the poster at the registration desk on a Vietnam project they're doing, A Face for Every Name. There's an effort to build a wall of faces. It's a lasting tribute plan for the Education Center at the Vietnam War Memorial. They're trying to get pictures of Vietnam veterans. They're missing many pictures of veterans from the Milwaukee area. So if you know of people who could contribute a picture, you can contact or get in touch with the Wisconsin Public Radio people through their website, wpr.org/Milwaukee. It's the Face for Every Name project, and there's more info by the registration desk. But they've been one of our co-sponsors for this evening. Also, Milwaukee Public Television, that, as I mentioned, airs our International Focus TV show. We'll have interviews with Maina and Maina Kiai and Lynn Wells. Wisconsin Public Radio, WWM, Milwaukee Public Radio, is airing an interview with Lynn Wells on their Lake Effect program. I want to also thank the Institute for Economics and Peace, which has provided curricular resources for the participating high schools. That's all my thank yous. And thank you for coming out and being part of this discussion. The format of the program, we're going to spend the balance of our first hour till about 7 with presentations, short presentations from our speakers. I'm going to have some question and answer with them as a panel. We'll take a short break, probably shorter than even we originally intended, given that we started late, and then open it up to audience questions. And we look forward to a very vibrant back and forth with the panel and you, our guests. We'll have microphones that will be passed around for that question and answer period, but we'll say more about that in a minute. So let me introduce to you our panel. You have longer bios in the program, so I won't go in depth. Diana Chigas, immediately to my right, is the Professor of Practice, International Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at the Fletcher School. Because one job is not enough, she's also the co-director of the Reflecting on Peace Practice project at the Collaborative for Development Action in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maina Kiai is Executive Director of InformAction, a non-governmental organization in Kenya, an activist organization. Also serves as UN Special Rapporteur for the rights to freedom and peaceful assembly and association. And then on the end is Linton Wells II. He's Director of the Center for Technology and National Security Policy at the National Defense University. He also served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Department of Defense in Washington. So please, if you will, welcome our panel. So I'd like to ask, we've asked them all to prepare a fairly short opening on this question of how do they think about security? How do they define security in its various dimensions? So I'd like to ask Lynn, if you would start, and then Maina, and then Diana.
Certainly. Can you all hear me in the back? Some years ago, I was on a panel with the columnist Tom Friedman and Amory Lovins, who heads the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado, does a lot of energy work. And Amory asked, what is real security? And he then proceeded to define it as the freedom from fear of privation and the freedom from fear of attack. And I've spent a lot of time trying to poke holes in that, and I think it's a pretty good definition. Because the freedom from fear of attack runs the gamut from cross-border attack to domestic violence to gangs in your neighborhood to drug cartels. And the freedom of fear of privation runs the gamut from failures of food distribution systems to lack of water to whatever. So anyway, so that's kind of what I use as my definition of security when we're talking about it, not just how many planes, tanks, ships we have, but from the standpoint of the individuals in a society, are you relatively free from privation, fear of privation or attack? In talking about the topic here today, does peace pay? One of the thoughts was, what are the costs of war? Well, clearly there are the costs of conducting a war, of the operations and maintenance costs of flying aircraft and steaming ships. And if you're not in a war, then you're not paying those. But there's also the question about what activities do you need to carry out to reduce the likelihood that you will get in a war. And part of that is investment, part of that is diplomacy, part of that is development. This is a complicated set of equations. So when you think about what kind of capabilities would be needed for an unpredictable, complex future, which especially you high school students here will be facing, it's perhaps worth remembering that the Department of Defense divides conflict up into 6 phases. Phase 0 is pre-war peace and stability. Phase 1 is the immediate pre-crisis saber-rattling, deterrence, dissuasion, things like that. Phases 2 and 3 are basically the kill people and break things phase. Phase 4 is post-war stability operations. Phase 5 is return to civilian rule and reconstruction. So in the wake of the Iraq invasion in 2003, the Secretary of Defense chartered the Defense Science Board to look at how Defense Department was spending its resources. And what they found was that about 95% of our money was going into phases 2 and 3, basically going into the combat phases. And so what happened in Iraq is that there was a plan for a combat phase to go on. While that was going on, there'd be the post-war reconstruction and stabilization that would ramp up. And actually what happened is the war ended so quickly that there was no post-war stabilization in place, partly with the resultant chaos that we've seen. So as a result, in 2005, in what is truly a tectonic shift of emphasis for the Department of Defense, the Secretary directed that in the future, major stability operations, post-war stabilization reconstruction, would be accorded priority comparable to major combat operations. This is just a huge change for both the planning and training of the Department of Defense. In addition, 2 years later, the chiefs of naval operations, the commandants of the Marine Guard and the Coast Guard signed a maritime strategy that says that preventing war is as important as winning it. Okay. So here you have this military that everybody thinks of as going out there and wanting to drop bombs and whatever, and you now have a doctrine that says if you get in a war, you've got to find a way to stabilize things and return to civilian rule, and oh, by the way, avoiding the war in the first place is the highest priority. And these are enormous changes in thinking in defense. So what this means is in early 2012, the Secretary of Defense laid out a strategic guidance for the department. And in it, he laid out 10 mission areas for DOD, for Department of Defense. And 4 of these are basically post-war stabilization reconstruction, building the capacity of partner nations so they can avoid getting into conflict in the first place, so they stay in a stable situation, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and what's called defense support of civil authorities, which is basically here in the United States providing support to governors and people like that after disasters. So of the 10 missions of the Department of Defense, probably 4 are not things that most people think about. They're associated with conflict termination, conflict avoidance, and disaster relief. So one of the questions here is, should this mission reside in the United States or elsewhere? Part of this is going to be a whole-of-government effort. You have the State Department that does diplomacy. You have the Agency for International Development that does development. You've got Department of Agriculture that tries to help with food security around the world. You've got Department of Energy, and lots of different whole-of-government people are working this. But one of the things that's also come out since 2003, and I think this is very healthy, is the recognition that other players besides government are really important in this. So you have non-governmental organizations, you've got commercial business, you've got international organizations like the United Nations. If you look at Haiti, there were something like over 1,000 non-governmental organizations on the ground in Haiti trying to distribute food, keep from tripping over each other, helping with medical supplies, whatever. So it's a much more complicated situation than people think of. And the military tends to think in terms of unity of command. Right? You have the commander, and everything flows down to the troops. In these situations, you will never get unity of command. You will never see this again. And so the question is, how do you achieve unity of action in situations where there is no unity of command? How do you tie together all the disparate parts of this equation in order to get to stability, in order to get to a situation, going back to the beginning, of real security, where you do have freedom from fear of privation and freedom from fear of attack? So I have some more, but let me stop here, and the other panelists will pick it up later.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Maina.
Thank you very much, and thanks. And it's a great honor to be here. And before I start, let me say that I think this is my second time in Wisconsin. The first time I came here was when it was my second winter living in the United States. And a friend of mine, Sean Skelton, decided to drive with me for Christmas to Green Bay at his family home. So we drove in this car, this little Volkswagen that didn't have a bonnet on the top that came off. So it was heating up. So thank God it was cold, so we didn't stop anywhere. But we ended up at Green Bay, and I had my first experience of walking on water when we walked on Lake Michigan, and I have pictures to prove it. So it's nice to be back here. On the context, in the question that's been asked about peace and security, I want to take it a little bit from the angle that Lynn has, and talk about it in the context of my work in Kenya. And we've just come from an election in Kenya, which was by and large very peaceful. The voting went on very well. When the results were announced, nobody went off and killed the other, as happened the last time. And it has been described by many people as a very peaceful, successful election. However, the truth of the matter is that it is peaceful in the sense that there's absence of violence. But the tensions and the difficulties that were there before still exist. So we've been calling it a calm. And for us, there's a big distinction between calm and peace. So calm you can have, as there was calm in Tunisia, and there was calm in Egypt, as there was calm under Hafez Assad in Syria. So calm is not necessarily peace, and the absence of violence and the absence of conflict is not peace. What counts for us is a just peace. So when I come at this from the human rights angle, which is what I do, and for us it is primarily one of the big things is the question of impunity. And in my societies and the region that I come from, it's the fact that people who are powerful, people who are rich, will get away with it. I tell you, in our countries, you can murder people and you will get away with it. Because, sometimes it is, as we have a saying in Kenya that why hire a lawyer when you can pay a judge? So there's many places in the sense, and that's not the worst of it. Actually, the worst of it is our police force, which is absolutely corrupt and easy to manipulate. So the whole question of impunity has become a big one for us. And though we may have calm, if we don't have if we don't have justice and we don't have truth, then we will not succeed. In 2008, when Kenya was in the news for the violence, and to the surprise of many people I know across the world, there was a shock that Kenya could go the way it did, because everybody thought of Kenya as the lions and the leopards and the elephants, forgetting there are people there who have very many tensions among ourselves. But one of the things that happened was that there was a very strong push for that calm in 2008. And there was a big group of people led by what we like to call the development side of organizations and the humanitarians, saying, just accept the results, let's have calm, let's have peace, and we move on. It was very difficult. So we then formed a network, a coalition of groups, which we called Kenyans for Peace Through Truth and Justice. Because we were very clear that without that truth and justice, you cannot have peace. You can keep it calm for a few months, for a few years, but until you address those elements of marginalization, those elements of exclusion, those elements of warped development, those elements of a gap between the rich and the poor that grows and grows and grows that you can't see where it's going anymore. If you don't address those, and if you don't address the issues of accountability, that if you're poor, and you steal a chicken to feed your children, you will be jailed for 20 years in Kenya. If you steal $1 million, you will, if you're unlucky, you will pay a fine of $20,000. That's how it works in Kenya. If you're unlucky, you pay a fine. So all those differences become very stark. And then we have differences of exclusion based upon the ethnic group that we come from. So if you come from an ethnic group that's not the president's ethnic group, then you're going to be in trouble. That's all the context at the domestic level. Regionally, around us in Kenya, we have Somalia, and we have the United States' famous war on terror, which says essentially, if you're a Muslim and you're Somali of Somali origin, or even if you're of Kenyan, of Arab or Swahili origin, but you're a Muslim, you are a potential terrorist. And because Kenya has subscribed to the war on terror with the United States, it means a whole community of Muslims feels marginalized, and they have gotten more and more radicalized. And so it does not add up at all to this sense of peace and security, because the war on terror is led by the military, essentially. And the US, to its credit, sometimes tries. I mean, they come in and support the Muslim festivals, the cultural festivals, to try and show that they're not really against the Muslim faith. But when the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia was in power, the United States, through Ethiopia, sent troops and they took it down, and people ran across the border into Kenya. They were arrested, many of them were arrested and interrogated, and I've talked to a few of them who were interrogated, and I don't know whether they're terrorists or not, but I know that they were tortured seriously. And when civil society in Kenya began making making noise about it. They were taken off quickly, and there was rendition from Kenya to Ethiopia, because Ethiopia doesn't ask the questions. There's no civil society to ask the questions. So all these things lead to tensions, and they lead to the question then of, do we have security? Do we not have security? Whenever any explosion happens in Kenya, the first thing people say, Al-Shabaab, Al-Shabaab. But if you follow Al-Shabaab, every single bombing they do, they take credit. They always take credit. It is in their interest as terrorists to take credit. But you've had a series of bombs and grenades blowing up, and not many people dying, but injuries happening. You have absolutely nothing from Al-Shabaab. But everybody, and our perception as Kenyans even, this is not just Americans or just the elite, even ordinary Kenyans have bought into that rhetoric now and bought into that pattern. So that exclusion of the Muslim community, which is about 20 to 30% of the country, becomes an issue of concern for us in terms of exclusion. So let me leave it there for now, just so we can have the discussions as we go on. But from our perspective, it's the sense that peace is necessary. The absence of violence and conflict is necessary for us to conduct human rights work and get the human rights state we want. But then it's not enough. It's certainly not enough, and we have to go deeper into that and deal with inequalities of life and deal with the substances that help us have a sense of a democratic system to be able to move forward. Thank you.
I asked Dinah to speak third because she has all the answers to all these problems. So.
Yeah, but not as good stories.
And you have 5 minutes. So. No.
Okay, I'll take 4 minutes.
Yeah. No.
So yesterday I taught a class called The New Frontier, Business, Conflict, and Development. And we started by showing a movie of a big dam project in Panama where a U.S. company was constructing one of these mega dams. Without consulting, they flew the community, the indigenous leaders, into the capital, forced them to sign their rights, the approval, proceeded with the dam. The dam flooded the villages. The villagers complained that they hadn't been given any notice. They fled and are now in quite destitute circumstances between an airport and human waste. Company had made promises that they hadn't kept about building houses, about education and schools. Community got together and protested, and they were put down in many ways, as they were in Kenya, quite violently by the government using company helicopters. So why did I start the class like that? We have a lot of stories over the last decades about how companies have fueled conflict, how mineral extraction in the Congo has made conflict much worse. In Burma, Myanmar, how the oil companies have actually been complicit and have been accused of helping the government do forced labor and commit human rights abuses. So why is business the new frontier for peace? And I think it's evolving. In the past, companies would make profit and they would sort of work around conflict and these issues. As long as they got their permission from the government, everything was legal, they would go ahead and do that. And I think they're seeing now, for a number of reasons, that the tide is changing. And so this is kind of, as Lynn was saying, one of the new actors that I think we're going to need to really be thinking about dealing with as we move forward doing peace-building work. The first is just YouTube and social media. Some Latin American manager once said to me, anything said anywhere the company says will be heard immediately everywhere. So the risk to the reputation of these companies is huge. You can't do anything wrong in Colombia now without it affecting your ability to do business in Ghana. So they now have to start worrying about it. International norms have evolved dramatically. In 2000, the UN Global Compact brought together businesses, the UN, civil society to really look at what does responsible business look like in a lot of these places. How can business not do harm and actually do some help? They assess how businesses are doing every year. I recently counted as part of a project, there are at least 42 different instruments, standards that businesses now may need to comply with, from environmental to labor to conflict to human rights, as they're going in that have nothing to do with their financial profits. So there's a lot of, this is what people are now expecting. They're expecting them to behave better. And there's a lot of pressure from NGOs, lawsuits. Local communities are now finally feeling much more confident and are rising up and saying, okay, you need to pay attention to some of the issues, social issues, in the communities, in the countries. And so companies are now starting to talk about a social license to operate and having to bring in social performance as well as financial performance into how they're thinking. And finally, some people are starting to try to quantify the costs. It looks like what they call non-technical risks. Non-technical risks mean anything that doesn't have to do with exactly the project and the business that they're doing, account for nearly half of all the risks faced by companies now in conflict countries or fragile states. With risk related to conflict and with relationships with community being more than half of that. It can erode profit by up to 50%. One company lost, I think, $6.5 billion in delays and lost opportunity over a 2-year period because of these kinds of. So they're big numbers. They're estimating $12 trillion has been lost in the Middle East for lost opportunities because of conflict. So companies are starting to see that this also has financial implications on their businesses. And it goes for everything from increased security measures, you have to pay more insurance premiums, you can't move around, you have to pay higher transport costs, property gets destroyed, markets get disrupted, production is delayed, you get consumer campaigns, allegations of human rights, the list goes on. So they get that it's affecting their assets, it's affecting their operations, it's affecting their reputation, and the opportunities they have. So in that sense, you're now seeing companies starting to think more in terms of, all right, how do we get a social license to operate? How do we engage with stakeholders? It used to be that we'd start with corporate social responsibility. We'll give the community a school, a hospital, give a few things, and they're now realizing that you can't buy the relationship. And managers are saying, well, yes, it's very nice, and the community will thank you, but it really isn't addressing the root causes, and we need to start getting engaged. So it's no longer sufficient to work around these issues and be blind to the conflict, but you have to think about how you impact the situation, how you make it worse, and how you can make it better by engaging much more constructively with communities and people, but also with actors like the NGOs, with the World Bank, with the UN, with some of the others who are working on peace. And so I'll also stop there so we can go into questions.
Great. It's good because I was really starting to get a bit schizophrenic in listening to you all. So in each of what you said, it was both really hopeful but also concerning. So Lynn, you talked about how the security sector, particularly, for example, the Department of Defense, but also bringing in with that USAID and the State Department, are thinking about the mission differently, and defining prevention and stabilization as being equally or more important than war fighting, which had been the traditional bread and butter. On the other hand, you're thinking that's great, that these things are as, if not important, or more important. On the other hand, you're thinking, well, do I want those people involved in the humanitarian work and so on? Maina, you said you talked about the benefits of the calm, of the lack of violence, but then are we really building toward calm or toward a peace through justice and truth, as you put it? And so seeing both from the social aspect, the plus and the difficult thing there. And then Diana, we're talking about some of the role of the changing role of the private sector in peace and its attitude toward peace. Again, great, because there are all those resources, they're on the ground, they help bring maybe long-term sustainability and development. On the other hand, is there a darker side to the monetization of peace and so on, and is that a problem? So I thought maybe I would have each of you talk about that a little bit. I want to have a little private time with Lynn first, so if Maina and Diana, if you could just give us a second here. So Lynn, my reaction, just from I'm thinking of the DoD as a business, and I'm thinking of your traditional sort of stock and trade being kind of war fighting. And what you just described in terms of if I think of what you described as being kind of the changing business plan, I'm thinking, really? Like, is peace really, isn't that bad for business? I mean, can you guys really survive in that environment where your mission is just going so far from what it traditionally has been and what at least the public thinks of it as being? So how are you really going to be able to do this? Is the security community really going to be able to make this transition to this new way of thinking about peace and security?
So I think the point is the money is appropriated to the Department of Defense to fight and win the nation's wars. It's not appropriated to build wells and build schools or to do the sort of things the AID does. And so even as one can focus on so-called phase zero and avoiding conflict and this, as a commander of a major combatant command told me the other day, phase zero is a strategy of hope. It's not a strategy of essentially hard-headed combat. So one has to have the capability developed somewhere in order to be able to deter, dissuade, defend should the other four missions I laid out earlier fail. But so in that question is what might be considered a peace industry, because there clearly is a defense industry. And so obviously lots of nations, including the United States, have profited a lot over time by trading with combatants. So that's always going to go on, I think. In the defense industry, as we look at these new missions and you get more unmanned vehicles and you get more cyber and you get more things like that, the nation will have an opportunity in this time of fiscal austerity to choose. As someone once said, it's been attributed to Winston Churchill, it was actually Lord Rutherford, gentlemen, we're out of money, now we must think. And so that's kind of the location where we're headed now. But there's also, and this gets back to the point about peace is not just the absence of war. I was long ago in there are industries such as travel that clearly benefit from peace. And there are certain parts of financial industries that benefit from peace. Years ago I was in Southeast Asia, in Manila, this during Vietnam. And I asked a banker, what would you do if the U.S. pulled out of the bases at Clark and Subic? And his answer was, I would immediately call in the softest third of my loans across Southeast Asia. A couple of years ago, I was in Singapore. And I was astonished at the number of times Singaporean government officials told me this, which I took it to be an agreed government position. They universally congratulated me on America's strategic victory in Vietnam. To which my answer was, what? To which their reply was, think back to 1965, which was the beginning of Singapore. It's the time of Konfrontasi, where Sukarno in Indonesia has vowed the destruction of Singapore. They've just been kicked out of the Malay Federation. There are armed bands in the cities every night, or every week. And so their point was, however traumatic Vietnam was for America, however badly it turned out for South Vietnam, without the investment the United States made in Vietnam, there is no way that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in general, and Singapore in particular, would ever have gotten the breathing space to have developed the way it did. And so the question is, even as you focus on these phase zeros and maintain the ability to do phase 2, 3, whatever, the ability to preserve a stable environment to allow the institutions, what I think you're beginning to talk about. How do you develop stable institutions of law, of justice, of finance, of things like that, is as important a part of peacekeeping and peace industry as just being able to fight. So,
Maina, what if we could pick up on this concept of a peace industry? Yes. Because it seems to have had a double-edged impact in Kenya, in the experiences that you've had, and the hey, let's just get along and be nice and let some room for institutions to grow and all that, versus becoming, addicted to the surface calm and not actually investing. So is the peace industry really focused on a very shallow level, or is it possible to think of a peace industry that will foster changes at the level that you were talking about?
Well, I think the experiences we have had in Kenya the last 5 years is that the peace industry, because there is a peace industry for sure, and there's a there's a whole cartel of groups that get funding and survive economically from the peace industry, has been quite surface, at the very much the surface, and working with people and at people to maintain calm, to make sure that we don't fight and that it's not good to fight, but doesn't go deeper than that. I'm not sure whether it can go deeper than that, whether that's its role or it's somebody else's role, because the key issues that are important are the building, as Lynn says, of institutions, but also it's also the state itself taking the active measures it needs to take so that people can have a better sense of themselves. I mean, I think for countries like Kenya, which is 50 years old this year, is that we're not a nation yet. We're very much a country of distinct ethnic groups, because the state and the whole state and the governments have never actively sought to make us a nation. We don't have the mythology that create nations. In this country, it's the Plymouth coming in here and all the other things that happen, and people feeling the Civil War created America the Great and America the Beautiful. But those mythologies are quite good, and that is a necessary. That narrative is necessary to have. So you can create a nation that makes sense to you, and you can say, I am a Kenyan because of this. I am an American because the French have their own mythologies and narratives about their food and why it's so unique to be French. We don't have that in our societies in many parts of Africa. So the peace industry perhaps needs to work a little closer and a little more in-depth with other actors, and they don't do that. So there's a lot of money that has been pumped into calm, into let's love your neighbor, you must not fight the person, love your neighbor, and it doesn't go beyond that. And I'm not sure it's for them, but building those strategic alliances that need to be built around truth and justice and anti-impunity and issues around marginalization and equity that need to be done. They have to be done. I think that's the next step, I suppose, that needs to happen. But of course, clearly, calm should give us the space to be able to build these other things. But on the other hand, calm can be enough. That's what a repressive state is happy to have calm. That's all it needs. It doesn't want peace because it doesn't want to do all those things. And then we have Syria, and then we have the Arab Spring, and then we have all the wars that have happened on. So you're never quite sure, at what stage do you say the calm is sufficient? When do you say this is enough calm? Let's have some activity. I mean, in this last elections in Kenya, there was a conventional agreement between the media and the government and the institutions that nobody should be allowed to criticize the elections as they went on. Those are absolutely agreed. You would not get the space in the media to criticize anything that happened. It just said that's not good because it will look as though you are inciting people. The whole idea of peaceful assembly was seen as a sign of conflict. So if you say, let's get together and march and express ourselves, the answer was the police will come for you and bat you down, and you'll get no support from the society because calm was so important. So in a sense, you've got to be careful so that the agenda of peace does not become a weapon against justice and against building us forward.
So, Dinah, I know that you do a lot of work with non-governmental organizations, with civil society organizations around the world. As well as your organization does also look at corporate engagement and how to do that effectively. So what's your prognosis on the degree to which the private sector is going to be a force for keeping it at a shallow calm, or will be a partner in building the deeper, longer-term drivers of peace and stability, and perhaps the gap between them and what you hear from the local civil society organizations on that same question?
One way to look at it is to look at intentions. And so are we ever going to expect companies to come in with the kinds of intentions that development actors and peace builders have? No. They're there to do business. On the other hand, I do think in a number of these countries, the private sector has resources and has means to help address a lot of the problems that Maina was talking about economic exclusion, some of the equity issues, employment. A number of these issues you can partner and need to partner with the private sector. You can't leave them out, which I think the development industry in the sense has. kind of kept the private sector a bit at arm's length. Private sector, at least the more enlightened businesses, I think now, are thinking, and you can start seeing partnerships, in Iraq where Scania, the truck maker, is employing ex-combatants and partnering with NGOs who are dealing with some of the psychosocial issues. So you're starting to see ways in which they can partner to say, look, we need to deal with some of these deeper issues. Not just let's be friends, but let's actually see, how are we going to address some of these root causes that have kind of led to recurrence of violence over many years.
So we just got a few minutes before I think we wanted to give a little bit of a stretch break for folks. But I'm wondering if each of you could take a couple minutes and speak to a bright spot, speak to a success story where, and in particular, of ways in which this commitment to a deeper peace you've seen realized, or you see, do we see parts of the security sector that are actually not thinking just in terms of the absence of violence, but really a deeper, longer-term peace in the society? And I'll put that to Maina and to Diane as well. But if you can think of a success story, something that gives you hope that we're not just going to be rebranding this in a way that feels good, but is very shallow piece, but is really a deeper piece in both concept and practice.
So I think there's a striking story actually in the Philippines. In that, at the beginning, right after 9/11, the southern Philippines, the Muslim regions of Mindanao, were the scene of Abu Sayyaf and some of the most virulent terrorist groups outside of the Middle East. Not only have those been defeated, but there were two rebellions in the Philippines. One was the Islamic Revolution in the South, or rebellion. The other was a New People's Army, which is kind of a communist rebellion in the central Philippines. About a couple of years ago, the Philippines established, I've gotten the name wrong, but something like the Philippine Development Command. And this is a group of the Philippine Army. And they went in and built a little village, city, maybe 2,000 or so people, in Bataan, which was one of the high places of the Philippine New People's Army. And this had schools, it had nice housing, it had commercial areas, it had communications. And what they found after a year or two is that there were about 2,700 people in the village, and the 2,000 they planned. And what had happened was 700 of the guerrillas had come down out of the mountains and basically said, hey, this is what I've been asking for. This is what we're trying to get to. And the rebellion is largely petered out in that place. But the point was, it was the actions of the Philippine government. It was not the foreigners who did it for them. It is they who did it for themselves. As Maina said, they built the institutions, they set up the opportunity for further development. And I think those sorts of things, you're seeing more and more countries looking at trying to do it. How well they'll execute, I'm not sure, but at least I think the attitude that says we can't always be dependent on the outsiders to come in and Americans have a really bad record of going in and trying to impose our solutions on foreign peoples, which either may not be appropriate, or maybe the technology may be wrong, or we may have the end state. The trick is how you build the institutions within the local governments to cause them to take care of their own people. And I think we're starting to see some places where that idea is taking place.
Okay. Maina?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hope. I think that, and I think for me, the whole acceptance and understanding now of the concept of human rights defenders is one, and that's across the world, is one that brings us hope, because this is a recognition of people who put out their lives and live their lives in terms of trying to bring a human rights and a just society across the world. And I was very lucky a few weeks ago to be a part of a meeting in Stockholm with human rights defenders, mainly from the former Soviet Union and former USSR, and some of the stories and some of the experiences were amazing. And one of the stars is a Serbian woman who began the Humanitarian Law Project, which is serving the Kosovars and serving the Bosnians and serving the Croats. So this is a person whose nation has been fighting these guys, and she set up this organization to actually help them in remembrance and in justice and accountability. And I think that to me is what gives me hope, is that across the world there are individuals who believe in a just society. There are people who believe and are committed to making things better. And that's, I'm sure, it happens even here in Wisconsin, because we followed your issues with the unions a few years ago. So, I know there are people who are concerned with a just society. And it's those people that I think will change the world and will make the world a better place. And the fact that there is greater and greater recognition. The other day, the UN General Assembly, or the Human Rights Council actually, passed a resolution that elevates the human rights defenders to another level. Then that includes countries that actually execute and prosecute them. But there's a recognition that they are an important part of society. So I think it's if we see it, and I know it doesn't sound like a concrete example, but human society has grown and changed from the efforts of individuals together in concert with others or as individuals. And I think that's what always gives me hope, that they keep getting born and keep working. And I think whether it's in Kenya, I think the vibrance and the strength of civil society and those defenders gives me hope that it won't be easy to take us backwards as opposed to moving forward.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a little less optimistic than you, but because you see so many places that get to that peace and stability, and then find it very difficult because the very same forms of governance that they were fighting against reinstall. It's just the people change. The systems and the institutions stay the same. And so in that sense, it is hopeful that human rights defenders and a number of folks are there to actually push to the next step. But I will tell a good story, because it is the next step. I started, in fact, with Rob in the late 80s, working in South Africa on the negotiations to end apartheid there. And of course, that was considered a huge success. There was transitional justice, the Truth Commission, and if anybody has been following South Africa lately, there are huge problems, and partly because a number of the issues, as Maina has said, were never addressed. Economic justice issues, economic access. So I just heard a story of a company, in fact, that probably got not so great marks on black economic empowerment, where there's some legislation, and decided they got into very self-reflective mode and said, okay, now we really have to do something about this. So they've revamped all of their management structures. They've started to work with, they've fired all their suppliers. They've started education programs and management programs to both bring in new employees, but also to help their new suppliers develop and be able to actually do the functions and have a sustainable business so that they can raise their incomes. So that kind of thing gives me hope. Yes, it's done under pressure, but you're now getting into sort of a next stage of dealing with some of the real issues that were really underlying what was going on, but that never got addressed in the first phase.
Great. So let's do this. If we can take a very crisp 5-minute break. Have your questions ready for the next section.